Our next speaker is Dr. Tim Driscoll. He's a mental health professional with the RFDS. He covers all of Western Queensland. He has been intimately involved in flood recovery and drought support programs. His Ned Kelly beard and friendly disposition make it seem like you've been friends with him for years, or so people say. I've just met him. And I'd like to welcome him to the stage now to share his presentation, How Mental Fitness Helps Ongoing On-Ground Decision Making. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you for tuning in. So what I'd like to talk about today is how mental fitness helps on-ground decision making. I think it's quite an important topic, and we'll just go on to the next slide. So what is mental fitness? Well, really what mental fitness is really another word for mental health without the stigma attached to it to the same degree. Often when people think about mental health, they often think about mental illness and some of the stigmas that are associated with those diagnoses. But really what mental health is essentially someone that's feeling good, getting along with other people, and able to get through the challenges of the days and the future ahead. So it does have some resilience to them. So that's what mental health really means. And I guess mental fitness is a way of sort of describing that in better terms, because mental health has had some of that stigma attached to it. But what we're really talking about is good mental health. So we'll just go to the next slide. With mental health, it's really actually important to think about that is not so much a dichotomy. What we're looking at is really a continuum from good mental health right down to poor mental health. So with good mental health, what we're looking at is someone that's doing well. They're feeling good within themselves. They're able to communicate with others, maintain those relationships, get on with people, and really be able to face those challenges that we face in life. So have some of that resilience. Poor mental health is very much the opposite of that. So when people are really struggling, so they might be having trouble getting along with other people, maybe feeling really miserable within themselves, and really finding it quite challenging to get through those daily challenges. And really what happens is that we tend to move up and down that continuum. So obviously mental illness is often considered in the poor mental health end, and that's often the case, but a diagnosis of a mental illness doesn't necessarily place you anywhere on that continuum on any given day. It's really, really important that we consider that's a moving continuum that we move on. So from feeling good to not feeling so good, and going well through the day and being productive, and other times when we might struggle a little bit. It's really important that we do consider that as a continuum, and certainly not mental health and mental illness. It's certainly a continuum. So we'll just go to the next slide. Mental illness is really common, absolutely incredibly common, and much more common than people may think. So we'll just move to the next slide. So 1 in 5 Australians in any given year will experience a mental illness. And that's the same wherever you live, whether you're in a city or living in regional or remote Queensland, for example, or other areas of Australia. But essentially, there is a difference in terms of getting help. So people tend to get further in the hole before they go and get help. And that's one of those things we do notice in regional and very remote particularly, is that people will wait a lot longer to get help. And sometimes that's a choice, and sometimes that's a service problem in terms of there's not availability of certainly a face-to-face service in many areas, although it's often telephone. But there is definitely limited access compared to someone in a metro setting. But those numbers are the same, essentially. So what we're looking at there is that it's a very, very common problem wherever you live. I'll just move to the next slide. And the most common of these by far are anxiety and depression. They make up the vast majority of mental health conditions anywhere, essentially. We look at very similar rates, but that's the vast majority of mental health difficulties that people face. Either one of those, or often a combination of those. So we are going to focus a little bit on those and how it does impact on decision making, but also the other side of that, which is mental fitness. Moving to the next slide. So the roles of emotion in decision making are actually quite significant. I mean, look at the world of advertising. Coca-Cola, which is one of the greatest successes of advertising, doesn't mention the fact that they've got a sugary black beverage. What they're selling is often a feeling, and that's what they're really trying to get at. It might be the youth, might be summer, but it's certainly a pleasant emotion that they're trying to pair with the product. So it really does show you that that's used very, very successfully in terms of promoting decision. The other thing is that it does also provide us information that may not be immediately obvious to us intellectually. Attraction versus repulsion, for example, is a big part of the way that we can make a decision. And it also can impact on the speed. So there might be a pressure to make a decision, which is an emotional push. But at the same time, if we're feeling very low, for example, that can actually slow down that process. We might be able to think about it. We might think about a lot, what we call sort of rumination, where it's going over and over in our head, but we might not get to the decision that we need to. Very, very clear how mood can impact on our decision making. And also assessing the relevance and even assessing how decisions sort of pan out. Our mood, our mental state can really affect our satisfaction or feelings of regret and disappointment, which aren't really necessarily based specifically on how well it's gone objectively. So emotions play a very big role. We'll just go to the next slide. So decision making in the rangelands is very challenging at times. You've got a very variable rainfall. There's uncertainty in many areas. There's some conflicting advice. There's global and local markets to consider, changing consumer sentiment, and complex decisions that need to be made that really have significant consequences. So there are important decisions and a complex decision which we need to get right as often as we can. So talking about the emotional side of that is key because we really want to optimize decision making. So we'll just go to the next slide. And look, optimal decision making, often we think about it in terms of taking those steps, which is fantastic in terms of maybe getting it on paper. For example, following a simple process like this one. So just note the next slide. A simple process of identifying that a problem needs a solution or that a decision needs to be made, really gathering that relevant information, looking for identifying, I guess, those alternatives and weighing the evidence in terms of, the pros and cons, that's what we're looking at there, and then choosing from those alternatives and then taking action and then looking at the review of that to see how we went in terms of those decisions and how that panned out. It's actually important to note that outcome is not always the best indicator of whether you've made good decisions or followed a good decision-making process, because there's other things that can absolutely impact on that. So it's not just the outcome which tells you whether a decision-making process was a successful one. We don't have control over the outcome, but we can stack the odds in our favour. So we'll just move to the next slide. Now, looking at that looks like quite an objective process. And I just wanted to take you to the extreme of that, which is something that we call amygdala hijacking, which happens in extreme cases of anxiety or even high levels of anxiety. Essentially what happens is our survival brain turns on. And what we do is we look for threat. We're looking around everywhere for threat, and we're looking either to fight, run away, or freeze is what happens in that process. So that higher thinking is actually turned off. It's hard to talk when we're really, really anxious. So it actually gets turned off. So you can imagine trying to make a decision when we're anxious. We're actually trying to make a decision with a lot of our brain turned off. So it's actually that when those emotions are really strong, particularly looking at anxiety, for example, a lot of our brain is turned off. And if you're making decisions, it's great to have your whole brain turned on. So that's a good thing to think about on the extreme. So we'll just go on to the next slide. So if we look at decision making and we go through that process again, we see that emotional health and mental fitness actually play a really, really key role. So if we look at the anxiety example that we just gave in terms of identifying that there might be a decision that needs to be made, if we're highly anxious, we might still be able to do that quite successfully. But when we go to gather relevant information, what we're going to be looking at is the threat information. We're certainly not going to be seeing opportunities. We're going to be in threat. Anxiety does to our mind. So we're not going to get a full collection of that information gathering stage. And when we're identifying alternatives, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be really looking at the risk side, and we're not going to be paying much attention to the reward side. So it's a key thing to realise that if we're really anxious at the time of making a decision, it is going to impact. We're going to be quite risk averse. And that can be quite a good thing, but it also means that we're missing out on potential opportunities on the other side of that equation. And certainly when we're weighing that evidence, which is the next stage in that model, really we're going to put extra weight on those things that are a threat or to us, and less on the upside of that. So, and when we're choosing alternatives, we're going to go for the low risk option. And taking action, look, we might actually be frozen by that anxiety, and it might stop us doing it. And when we're reviewing, we might also be looking again at less of what's gone so well and more of what might be a threat in the future. So it can really colour our decision-making process. And that's why emotional health and mental fitness are so important. So we can make better decisions. So we can see what happens with anxiety there. And if we've got that under control, what can happen is that we can make better quality decisions. So we'll just move to the next slide. So what do we do about it? That's a good question. So we'll move to the next slide and hopefully we'll have an answer. So some of the advice is really, really simple. It's what you tell anyone who's trying to be healthy, and a lot of this is the same for them. Healthy diet obviously keeps you well physically and keeps you well mentally. Regular exercise, if you're feeling strong within yourself, you're more confident to deal with life's challenges. But it's also great at combating mild depression. It works really, really well, works as well as therapy actually. Regular exercise. Now that's really important now if we want to keep our mental fitness up, which actually really does help us make better decisions. Those really also. If you are having trouble, some help with that, because what can happen if we let ourselves get run down mentally, we make poorer decisions, and then those things sort of load on top of us, and we've got a lot more problems to deal with, which makes life more of a struggle. And you can see how that can sort of spiral down. So if we can get onto those things early, we can really make a difference in terms of making better decisions and having our best sort of chance of progressing forward. The other one that's really important is social connectedness. People who are connected deal with challenges much better. They do far better when they're facing hard times, when they've got someone to talk to. They know that someone's there who cares about them. There's that supportiveness there. So we'll just move to the next slide now. So key to that social connection is actually talking to someone. Now, if you've got something that you're trying to make a big decision on, talking about it is one of the biggest things you can do. The funny thing is that when we talk about something, we think about it better. It's incredible to see. You would have seen this with a friend. They might have come to talk to you with an issue. You haven't given them any advice, but just through that process of them talking, they often come to a solution themselves. So we can actually clarify things in our mind by talking to someone. Now, that can be a friend, it can be a colleague, it can be someone that we trust, absolutely. It can be from a huge variety of backgrounds. Often that is that person that's in our close circle that we use. And it can absolutely help us make better decisions and also support our emotional health and our resilience, which is really, really key. If things are really going off track, maybe you're not sleeping, for example, a GP is a great point to call, checking to see what might be going on there. It might be something physical, might be something psychological. But really, when you stop sleeping, those things can really build up as well. It gets harder to deal with life when you're not getting enough sleep. So check in with your GP, or you find your mood's going down, or you're getting really anxious. Like the sooner you get in, the easier it is to get out of that hole. And obviously people like me as a psychologist or other mental health clinicians can absolutely also help with that process in terms of having those conversations and working out how to deal with those pressures of life and really build on that mental fitness and mental resilience. So it can be really quite helpful. And look, 80% of people that come and see a psychologist actually get significant benefit out of it. I don't think people realise just how useful that is. But it's quite a good number, really, certainly when you compare it to the things that we treat physical health conditions with. Often we don't get those sort of numbers. So it does work a lot of the time. So it's really worth considering because if it's left, a lot of things pile on top of it. So we'll just go on to the next slide now. So if anyone in the audience does want any further information about what we've talked about, or if you're in Western Queensland, certainly give us a call if you're looking to talk further about that, how we can build some of that mental fitness. If you find you're getting run down, or you're finding you're getting anxious, or your mood's low, or you might be just having trouble sleeping, certainly use us as a resource. Give us a call, send us an email. We'd be certainly happy to help in those areas, because we're certainly there. And people do get a lot of benefit out of it when they do use it. We're skeptical somewhat about mental health, But look, it really does help most of the people. 80% of the people that come along really do get significant benefit. So that's really worth trying. So that's the number there, but I'm sure you can make contact through the conference with me as well if you want further details. We're in Western Queensland generally, so if we just move on to the next slide now. So just moving on to the questions that we might have. That's really all I really want to go over today. I think I'm pretty much on time, hopefully. But thank you for everyone that came along and listened. I hope you got something out of it. But certainly contact with that information.